Port-au-Prince with roots from Leogan on my mother's side and Okai on my father's side. And I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C. as one of the co-founders of the Haitian Ladies Network. We are an organization that has a bold mission and a vision to create the largest global platform connecting all women and girls of Haitian descent to build community, share inspiration, and celebrate our shared Haitian heritage, history, and culture. Joining us in this project for this virtual series is a collective of Haitian-led and Black-led organizations that share a commitment to bring Haitian history to the center and unite with all who believe in a vision of a Haiti that is truly free to build our own future. We want to thank the Black Collective, Haitian American Foundation for Democracy, also known as HAFD, Sant Haitian Neighborhood Center, Island TV, Ayibopost, Haitian American Professionals Coalition, and Avanse Ansanm. This is a three-part series of virtual conversations focused on increasing our collective understanding of what happened after Haiti became the first Black independent in the Western Hemisphere. We read recently the groundbreaking New York Times comprehensive account of the ransom, the lost billions, and the true cost of freedom and its present day impacts. Our goals in curating this virtual series are to continue to keep this history in the public attention, amplify the learnings, and galvanize for collective action. We're excited to welcome today Catherine Porter and Constant Mehu from the New York Times. They have so much to share about the making of this series and engage in a moderated conversation with Magali Laguerre-Wilkinson and Joelle Dreyfus, our moderators for today. I will tell you a little bit about Magali and Joelle, and they will then introduce our speakers. Magali Laguerre-Wilkinson is the Vice President of News Programming and Executive Producer of Nick News at Nickelodeon. Prior to joining Nickelodeon, Magali worked for 60 Minutes and CBS News. She's reported on and produced domestic and international stories, winning Peabody and Emmy accolades for her work. Her Haitian roots have made her an invaluable producer on CBS News coverage of the country, including an Emmy-winning 60 Minutes report on the deadly earthquake there in 2010. She also served as correspondent for the 60 Minutes online franchise, 60 Minutes Overtime, and for CBS News. Before joining 60 Minutes, she worked as associate producer and producer for Tom Brokaw at NBC News. Magali is a native New Yorker with deep roots in Cap-Haïtien. She lives in New York with her husband, Bruce, and their daughters, Juliette and Josephine. Welcome, Magali.
Hello, merci beaucoup. Nice to see everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here and to continue this discussion, which is really going to be fascinating.
And Joelle Dreyfus is a journalist and editor whose international career spans more than 5 decades. He's a former Global Opinions contributing columnist for the Washington Post, where he wrote from Paris about race and politics in Europe, the United States, and his native Haiti. He served 10 years with Fortune magazine, with stints as Tokyo bureau chief and senior editor and as a technology columnist. He spent a decade as editor-in-chief of Technology Magazine, Herring and Information Week, and editor of PC Magazine. Before moving to France, he was managing editor of TheRoot.com, then owned by The Post, executive producer, executive editor of Black Enterprise, and a senior writer of Bloomberg Markets Magazine. He's currently working on a book, which we all await, about his family's 300-year relationship with Haiti. He is co-author with Charles Lawrence III of the Bach case, The Politics of Inequality, and many of his articles and essays have been included in compilations, including The Butterfly's Way, an anthology of writers in the Haitian diaspora edited by our beloved Edwidge Dansica. Joel's a native of Port-au-Prince, who grew up in Paris, Monrovia, Liberia, and New York City. He is a co-founder and a member of the Hall of Fame of the National Association of Black Journalists and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He served on the board of the American Society of Magazine Editors as a Pulitzer juror and is a board member of the Haitian Roundtable in New York. Welcome.
You're muted, Joel.
Yes, I'm just saying, I'm just a Haitian migrant worker. That's how I summarize my career. It was in journalism. This is very exciting. This is a wonderful series of articles that the Times did. And we're looking forward to hearing some more about how it all came together. Magali?
Yes, we are. So let's get going. Without further ado, let's introduce our two intrepid journalists who oversaw this incredible piece of investigative reporting and worked with quite a team. So I know that it's probably you're probably both very humble, but I'm going to brag for you a little bit right now. Catherine Porter, who headed this, joined the Times after 16 years at the Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper. Ms. Porter was Catherine. We can call you Catherine. We can all do first names, right? Catherine was part of the New York Times that won the Polk Award from Haiti and was a finalist for the Pulitzer. She has also won 2 national newspaper awards in Canada. Constant Mehu reports for the New York Times in France, and he joined the Paris bureau 2 years ago. Just, I'm sure, when things were really getting hot in the world. And I'm certain that in the past 2 years, this has possibly consumed most of your time reporting on this story, which I describe as a huge onion with many, many layers that you started to peel, and it just started to reveal one thing after the next. So I know that we can spend possibly the next almost 2 hours introducing both of you and your backgrounds, but let's really get into this discussion. And I'll throw it to Joel with the first question.
I've worked in enough news organizations to know that to do a project like this requires not only the enthusiasm of the reporters, but the backing of the infrastructure and the management. Can you tell us a little bit how this originated, this project on Haiti, and how you got the support for it?
Sure. Well, I am a reporter who started going to Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake. I would guess I was down there with you, Magali, in Port-au-Prince, and that was my introduction to Haiti. And I have continued to visit Haiti as a reporter, but also actually I have very close friendships there now too. So I go for personal reasons also for the last 12 years. And so, you know, for me, Haiti is that onion you've already, just mentioned, it is a place that the more I get to know, the more I thirst to know, to be honest. And I have been fascinated by Haiti since 2010. I continued to report on other things and come back to Haiti. But like you said, Joel, that there's no way that the story would exist just by myself. We have an editor who's the international editor. He's a man named Michael Slackman. And though he has never been to Haiti, he is fascinated by the country. And in 2017, I did a really big story for him. I was part of a series on death. And I did a story about death in Canada, about medically assisted death. And then I did a story in Haiti about a group of people who collect the abandoned dead for him. And he basically just started peppering me with questions. And they were the same kind of questions that I think any international correspondent going to Haiti asks themselves, which is, why is the country's infrastructure so horrifically feeble? Why is the country so impoverished, both in terms of the slums and people being poor, but also just the infrastructure of the country? And so he started peppering me with questions. And because I had been fascinated in Haiti for years, I had read about the so-called independence debt. And I said, well, there's this and there's this, but there's this independence debt that I've read about. And that sparked his imagination. And he said, well, tell me more about it. And, it's not hard to be quite captivated by the idea of the independence debt, because it completely is the reverse of what we think of in terms of reparations when we talk about reparations today, when it comes to slavery. And so his imagination was captured. Originally, my thought, I went down originally in early 2020, in January, to Haiti to do basically like a week and a half to meet people, to start meeting with historians, to see how I might do this story. I met with the president at the time, Jovenel Moïse, but I was very early in my research, and I had a plane ticket to go back on March 30th. And then the pandemic hit and everything was put on pause. At first, he asked me to continue working from afar. We met many historians that were very helpful sending, documents, but then it became clear that this story of the pandemic was not going to be a 2-week story or a month-long story. It was going to be the story of a year and then 2 years. And originally I had this idea that I would do a narrative story that would look, and I think I called you, Joel, to ask you about this. I had this idea that I would talk the descendants of enslaved people, and then link them to the descendants of the people who had received the payments. And it was going to be a narrative story. But the more I read and the more research I did, it became kind of clear that there was some of this history that was unknown. And so around April of last year, my editor, who again, Michael Slackman's super interested in this, said, I want you to jump back in, clear, no more pandemic writing from Canada. I'm based in Toronto. And he tapped Constant and 2 other investigative journalists, one based in London and one based in Brussels, to join us and to start digging into a story that would become much more investigative than the story I had initially envisioned.
Was the backing of Mrs. Slackman enough to get you the resources, or did he have to convince other editors, other people at the Times to support this project? Or did you know how big it would get?
I don't know the answer to that question, like what lobbying he had to do behind the scenes. I don't know. I do know that he was very much the driving force. So, I was busy working on, I had this on the side of my desk, and I had put together kind of a memo of unanswered questions based on all the reading I had done. And he said, Constant, I want you to be on this. And 2 investigative reporters are going to jump in and join you. And so it was really his muscle that put 4 people. Originally, Constant, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were only like very part-time. And then very quickly, as Constant was visiting all of these archives, it became clear that there was a great historical story we might be able to dig into. And then Michael Slackman cleared and said, Constant, you're no longer working on news in Paris. This is what you're going to work on.
Yeah, I mean, initially we didn't know that we would do a 4-part series. That's clear. I think initially the idea was even to do maybe just one big story, and the fact that each of us has different competencies, I would say, different spheres of interest as well. really brought to the project new layers, new aspects that we could highlight in this 200 years old story. So, for instance, the port on CIC, the French bank that was behind the National Bank of Haiti for about 3 decades. It was not originally in the project. We didn't know about it, but I remember that quite early on, Matt and Salam were really interested in the banks. First, because of the National City Bank and its involvement in Haiti, but also about, where, if and that was possible if some French banks had been involved too there, So really, each of us had different interests, different ideas, and I think that really helped broaden the project to this big 4-part series that it became.
I have a question, never in my life did I think I would see the area Dondon printed in the New York Times. Okay. And so what was the decision to start there? Because it's always the thread to the story of where is this going? I mean, I saw Dondon and I said, where is this going? Because I know this place, And so as reporters, and Constant, you mentioned that all of you have different competencies. How did you all, find that common denominator to get along? Were there fights? We want to know, was anything ugly? Was there, I'm sure there's mutual respect, but, getting in the weeds of doing something this massive, to be in accord together. How did you reach that point?
Yeah, I mean, unless I'm mistaken, Catherine, I cannot recall any fight, and I'm completely honest here, really. It is fun that each of us were living in different countries, different continents as well. So we were basically exchanging daily messages on WhatsApp. I only met Catherine maybe 3 weeks ago, despite having worked with her for more than a year. And we would have a weekly meeting also with our editors. For the first few months, our job was basically to read as much as possible, speak to as many historians as possible, try to get a sense of what was the story about, where it was going, whether we would have to trace the money, for instance, the payments, which we didn't think initially we would have to do, and that eventually became some sort of a cornerstone of that series. I think Catherine initially, but she will talk better than me about this, was working really on kind of the history of that debt, the foundations, the link with slavery, the families. I was working a little bit on families too, but I was also working a lot on the banks and the money, and trying to get a sense of where the money went, identifying the proper archives I would need to go to find some documents. Salam was really invested in tracing, in basically reporting what happened with the US. Matt was really into CIC, the French bank. So quite naturally, each of us found his own domain or sphere. Because I was based in France, I also reported a lot on what happened with the former president Aristide and the diplomat, etc. But yeah, everything went quite smoothly, I would say.
I find it quite stunning that so many people were open to speaking about this, including the former ambassador. Some of the officials that you spoke with were very open. Was that a surprise?
Yes, totally. No, totally. It's hard for me to say a few months later why they were so frank, so honest to us. There was one of the ambassadors, Yves Godel, I think he had some regrets also about France's role in Haiti as a whole. Not during his tenure as an ambassador, but just France's colonial past there, which may explain why he was so open to me. I think I hope that we also had worked a lot on the story, so we would come with very precise questions that would help us drive the interview and get some very detailed information that we would then cross-check with other sources. So yeah, I would say that I was surprised too, but each of the stories, for each of the stories, there were possibly from 50 to sometimes even 70 people who were interviewed. So you cross-checked everything with a lot of people, which actually makes it easier than to get a sense of what really happened on the ground. And that is not only for what happened in the early 2000s, but also what happened in the late 19th century,
The story, as many of the Haitian Americans on this event will remind us, the broad story is well known in Haiti, that we had this huge debt to guarantee our independence. But what made this so powerful was the documentation. And wanted you to talk a little bit about the available material, the archives. I think we often think that because Haiti went through a violent revolution, burned a lot of property and documents, even into the 19th century, we kept having revolts internally. How rich was the source of information? Can you talk a little bit about that?
You want to take a stab at that, Catherine?
Oh, I can start. So, it became clear to us by April, when I jumped back in, that there was not a consensus on how much Haiti paid. Most books would go to 90 million francs. But we were reading that there were late fees, there were interest fees. What were they? There was no consensus. And at first, I think we all really thought we would just find the book. We were looking and interviewing historians, just finding like whoever had done this. And finally, at one point, we just said to Constant, like, I don't think anyone's done this. Maybe we should do it. And it turns out that Constant has an MBA. So he was kind of like made for that. He's not only French and based in Paris, but he has an MBA. So he's a spreadsheet master and put together a spreadsheet, and I'll pass it to him. But the one thing I would say is that we also hired 3 researchers in Haiti. One is a journalist with Le Nouveliste who helped us basically dug out every article in the Haitian press around Aristide's campaign. Another is a historian named Charles Archin, who went and found the Haitian proposed budgets that were published in Le Moniteur. And in the end, I ended up going to get a CD-ROM of all of Le Moniteur's too, but he did a lot of legwork for us. And that helped us give us a sense of how much of the annual budget, at least a proposed budget, because we know the government often borrowed money after it put its budget together, but we got a sense of how much of the proposed budget year after year these payments made, and that was pretty valuable. So all of that information came from 2 libraries in Haiti, plus we went to and got the originals from Le Moniteur. And then I'll pass it to you, Constant.
Yeah, and I think there was also a third person who found those books from Frédéric Marcelin, right?
Yeah, my longtime collaborator, or someone I work with very regularly in Haiti, is a guy named Harold Isaac. And he went to his old professors, including, Mr. Bouteau. I saw the name Bouteau up here, like, to find old books that we just couldn't find anywhere else. And there's also a Haitian, a great archivist named Patrick Tardieu, who is based normally in Haiti, but since the pandemic started, he's been in Montreal, where there's a big library with Haitian historical texts, and he also dug up, old texts from the 1800s for us and 1900s for, that had some raw figures.
I was mentioning Marcelin because he was really key for that book, for that work. Marcelin was this finance minister in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who was a vocal opponent to the French financial control of Haiti. And he wrote 2-3 books. Some were focused on the debt, some others were more focused, centered on the National Bank of Haiti. That reproduced some numbers for the late 19th century. And that was central to our work of tracing the debt, because thanks to that book, we could actually cross-check the figures that I found in the archives of the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, which is this public French bank that collected all of the money throughout the 19th century. And we really needed, as many sources as possible to cross-check the figures. And I was actually impressed by the fact that we had the exact same figures down to the cents, which is kind of convincing when you have that level of preciseness. As Catherine said, initially we thought that we would find at least some solid estimates in books or research articles. When we realized that that wasn't possible, which I thought that we would do it ourselves, the tricky part was that all of those figures were actually scattered everywhere, in century-old letters by diplomats who were French diplomats who were fulminating against Haiti's late payments in brochures, in pamphlets, in the French financial press, in some archives from Haiti, in books from this finance minister. So it was really some sort of a scavenger hunt. And every time I found a figure, I would put it in this big Excel spreadsheet, mark what was the source, and day after day, I would start kind of
okay.
Oh,
No, you froze for a second.
All right.
Suspense.
Okay. Now I was just saying that day after day, we were kind of building out this spreadsheet, and after a few months, we had some sort of a decent picture of what the debt looked like, and this is when we started to talk to historians and economists who knew about that history. We talked to Clara Gistiguier, for instance, who's probably one of the best historians on the history of that double debt. We went to London as well to talk to Victor Bulmer Thomas, who's a British financial historian who specialized in the economic history of the Caribbean. And they would provide us some background, question, our methodology, and reassured us that we were on the right way.
I right now in the US, in many parts, there is this sort of questioning and this sensibility of speaking about history and things that make certain people uncomfortable. And my question to you is, how has this been received in France, by the general public? I see even in the chat that there's a reference to the historian Philippe Girard, who is somewhat of a denier or questions a lot of this. How has it been received in France? I know that here, anyway, the first week, everybody's hair was on fire when this came out. So how is it received in France,
It was actually, the French media has covered it. We've seen a lot of reports in Le Monde, Le Figaro, Libération.
You mean since your piece or in the past?
Oh, no, the piece itself.
Since the piece, yes,
yeah, exactly. Since
okay.
the piece appeared, they've only covered the stories. Not really the the kind of mind-boggling history that the story is about. You know, they covered the pieces, not really what that means, and it did not spark a debate. You know, I'm being totally honest. It did not cause any controversy or big historical debates in France. The French government has not reacted. The only institution that has reacted, to my surprise, to be honest, was the Crédit Mutuel, which is this French bank that owns the CIC. And about, I think that was 2 days. Yeah, that was 2 days after our stories came out. They published a statement saying that they would hire historians to research the past of CIC in Haiti, possibly as well in other former colonies. I'm not so sure about that. I was surprised about that because you know, debates about colonialism in France are very sensitive.
Really?
It is, yeah, it is some sort of, you know, I wouldn't say that it's, it is in a sense a taboo, I think, depending on which former colonies you talk about. This is especially a taboo for colonies like Algeria, I mean, more or less recently, but and there are all other colonies that France has just completely forgotten about, and that is the case for Haiti, because Haiti was one of the very first colonies of France. People in France are just not taught about it. Nobody in French schools is taught about the Haitian Revolution, and of course not about the double debt. So the kind of absence of big public reaction to the story in that sense is not that surprising, because there's no groundwork about this in France.
You know, it was interesting. I was just in Paris when I met Constant for the first time face to face and in real life, as we say. And I was staying at the bottom of the 16th arrondissement, and I was walking around with my kid, and we came to this little square, and it was like Rochambeau Square with this big statue of him. And I was like, oh my God. You know, so I think once you spent any time studying the Haitian Revolution and and Napoleon's troops, in Canada, Rochambeau Square would no longer be called Rochambeau Square, because the Canadian dialogue around colonialism has been fierce and very emotional, and it's been going on since I would say 2015. And so, you know, universities have been renamed, streets have been renamed. Anyway, it just so happens I stumbled onto the square and took a picture and sent it to Constance. Like, it seemed very suiting, I guess.
You know, I wanted to bring up also the fact that I think we also live in a very visual medium. I think when I say we, just people these days, you know, in these times, and to see things that are so recognizable globally, I think is what made this all the more poignant. Was it a surprise about the financing of the Eiffel Tower?
I think there was actually some sort of a misinterpretation. We never said that Asian money financed the Eiffel Tower. This is not what we say in the stories. What we say is that at the same time, when the CIC was using the National Bank of Haiti to make a lot of benefits, they were also financing the Eiffel Tower. But we have no idea about whether that money helped finance the Eiffel Tower. To be honest, I don't think so. I would be surprised, because the way the Eiffel Tower was financed was basically through loans that were emitted on the French market, not with the proper funds of the CIC. So some could say, yes, but money is fungible after all, true. But this is clearly not what we say in the stories.
This is where we did have fights, just so you know. We had lots of discussion about money is fungible. I mean, like, it's the most boring line of all time, but it was almost like this, like, drumbeat. Money is fungible. Like, did it fund this? Did it fund that? Like,
so Catherine, for our Haitian interpreting here, fungible would be defined as what, in a way to explain it a little clearer?
Like, I might make money from a whole bunch of different things and put it in my pocket. And then I spend the money on other things. You don't necessarily know if the money I made from selling newspaper on the street is the exact quarter or centime or gourd that I'm spending in the supermarket. But the idea is that it's all in one pot and then it goes out, and that you can't necessarily trace it exactly because it all goes into a pot. And then it goes out.
One other topic I wanted to bring up was the people who benefited from the money. And you had a short section where you talked about prominent families in France or elsewhere in Europe who were paid reparations. And some of these families are still around. In fact, I live in a building in Paris, which was built by the La Rochefoucauld family.
Mm.
And I remember going through these books that you looked at the National Archive in France and seeing their names as plantation owners. So can you talk a little bit about tracing the families in France and the reaction that you got for that? I thought that was going to rile up the French, if nothing else would, but the reaction has been pretty subdued, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my first inkling for this story was that narrative arc. So I was, from the very beginning, I was looking at what families made the most. You know, what were the top 20? I got a list of the top 20 families. At first, I did it with a researcher myself, that we went through those giant books. If you go to Aix-en-Provence, they had these big books which list over 6 years the decisions of a commission that was set up to award money, reparations. So we basically went through all the books and we did these huge spreadsheets. Later, this organization in France put it all online, the repairs website. But by then we'd already done our homework. We found a historian in Berlin who is a historian on Saint-Domingue. He also helped us point out who the biggest families were, and we started doing the genealogy of them. Now, of course, like the fact that Napoleon's wife family were inheritors of these payments, that is where a big bloodline is for a lot of the royalty in Europe, right? Because Napoleon had 4 stepchildren through her that all received these payments. One married the Emperor of Brazil, one married the Tsar of Russia's daughter, one became a duke in Germany. God, what was the last one? Anyway, but if you did the genealogy, you'd see that some of those people going down 7 generations were still royalty. The Prince Charles's first cousin, Maximilian von Baden, I think his last name is, his family received this money. The former king, like entitled at least of Greece, a prince in Belgium. So we went through, and that was really interesting to us because obviously those are still incredibly powerful people. Also, we found it was quite interesting to look through the Laborde's family because he was the biggest moneymaker. His head was chopped off during the French Revolution, but his children collected the most amount in terms of payment, and grandchildren too, because he had 3 massive plantations in the south, in an area that we discovered there's still a village called Laborde down near
Les Cailles,
near Okai. So we developed these massive spreadsheets on 16 families. Some of them were huge, like some of the Peyrac family had 500 plus living descendants at this point. And we we basically cold called. We hired two researchers that spent a long time just trying to track people and highlight who was interesting to us. And in the end, we talked to more than 30, and the vast majority had no idea. And, you know, like the last payments of the independence debt, so not talking about the banks, but just those reparation payments, ended in 1888, which was, you know, around, that was the late fees for the
1878, only for
1878.
the independence debt, the
Right.
indemnity. Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know what my family was doing back in 1878. Like, you can't really, you can't hold anyone to, obviously, to what our ancestors did, going back, or their ignorance around it. But the vast, I mean, they had no idea, most of them had no idea that their family had any history whatsoever in Haiti, let alone any history of payments.
You know, there's a question in the chat, which I think it may have crossed many people's minds, but in so much of the involvement in this, the Catholic Church, did they play any role at all in this? Est-ce qu'ils ont fait la sourde oreille? Did they, you know, with many conflicts around the world through time, they've been sort of on the sideline as a spectator. Were they merely a spectator? Did they put their hand in the pot as well?
It's a very good question, which we haven't investigated at all.
It's not like you didn't have enough going on, but
right.
It didn't come up. Like, the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
you know, really, when I think about the history of Haiti, I mean, obviously was there and had huge involvement in education, you know, and didn't recognize Haiti, like refused to recognize the country's independence. So it certainly played a role that way, along with, you know, the United States in terms of refusing to recognize. But we never saw any indication that you know, going through all of those books, I never saw any indication of someone from the Catholic Church getting payments. Now,
I think
it's a
that
really good idea, though. It's a good question. We could probably go back to see if the names of former priests, maybe they had personally owned property, but in terms of like the Catholic Church itself receiving
as an institution, yeah.
as an institution, I certainly saw no sign of that. But, you know, it's an interesting question that
I think part of the problem is that the church was essentially banished from Haiti from
Yeah.
independence until 1860, when they made an agreement, the Concordat,
to come
that
back.
allowed the church to come back in officially. The priests that were in Haiti were essentially rogue priests who were not connected to the Vatican up until that time. So that may be one of the reasons you see so little influence by the church.
And I believe when they started criticizing, François Duvalier ended up kicking them out in the late 50s, early 60s, if I'm not mistaken, Joël. The Jesuits, anyway.
To answer your question, Magali, you asked before, why Don Don? Like, and I
Yes.
have to say, I love Don Don. Like, I would go back to Don Don every visit.
Okay, but you have to say Don Don.
Don Don. I love Don Don. I love, it's like a garden. It's so beautiful. I was back in Haiti. So we'd done all this research, and I was back in Haiti for the assassination of the president. And I was on the ground, and after going to cover the funeral up in Cap Haitian, I've been doing, you know, by that point, it had been very clear from our reporting that the bulk of all of the government's income, but these payments also came from export taxes on coffee farmers. So it was clear that we should look at coffee, you know, and Don Don is the first place that coffee started in terms of the first plantations. When it was Saint-Domingue, that's where the first plantations were cut. It also, you know, I had a lot of interest. I really wanted to go down to the south to see the coffee, like where coffee is in the last decade become more of a robust enterprise. But the road to go there is where all of the gangs, in terms of where you have to go through Croix de Bouquet, became too dangerous. So I was up in Cap Haitian, and I was like, well, they've got four coffee cooperatives up in Dondon. I called one. I'd love to come up and see. I came up. One of them hosted me. Actually, there's three and a half really, but they all are named after revolutionary heroes. And I went and did, and I just thought, as soon as I spent time on going up to the coffee fields, or to the petit jardin of the different farmers, it became clear this was like a perfect place to set the story. Like the citadel is there, you can see it. It is such a symbol, right, of Haitian independence, but also Haitian fear of reinvasion. Is this huge, it looms over. And, one of the farmers took me way up to right underneath the citadel where he has a family plot. And while we were having a break, he said, when I was a kid and my father owned this land, you couldn't see the citadel because the trees were so thick.
So lush, yeah.
Lush. But then, when I went out to one of the sections of Dondon, the Matador section, and went to the Vincent Auger cooperative there, it was even more profound because electricity has never come to that section. They've never had electricity. I went out with farmers where we went and we collected the water from the nearby stream. And so that element of, the descendants of coffee farmers from this area have been paying for this tax for so long, and have recouped none of the benefits that, if that money had gone into, people say, oh, we don't know what it would have gone to. Sure, might not have gone anywhere, but if it had gone into some things like electricity, potable water, sewage systems, like in any part of Haiti, that concept was just so clear to me there. And the vast majority, I spent 2 evenings at the gates of the cooperative, of the Vincent Auger cooperative, and I basically did a survey of everyone coming in. Like, have you ever heard of the independence debt? Have you heard of the double debt? And just talked to like dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and had great conversations that were often very humorous, but only 2 people had heard of it. And that is not taught in that kind of way. Many of them had never gone to school. And the 2 that had one was still in school and one had gone to school. And so that was also, I thought, kind of telling and important.
Constant, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Catherine summed it up quite well. I mean, we knew from what we read that coffee was a major part of the Asian economy. We had some stats, very interesting stats, about how in the early 20th century, Haiti was, I think, devoting about 2/3 of its coffee taxes to paying back its debt. That tells you a lot about what was left to invest in education and all. But just getting the colors from the ground that Catherine found was really crucial, to kind of bring back the story to today.
There have been 2 common criticisms of your series that I've seen people raise a number of times. One is that they feel you let the Haitian elite off the hook too easily, that by blaming the payment of the debt, you let people off the hook who could have done much more for Haiti. What's your response to that?
I can answer it. I mean, first of all, we in the first story, the big one, there's quite a big part on Duvalier and his role in the state of Haiti today. And the reason why we wrote that part on Duvalier was also to address that concern, which is to say, yes, the debt certainly played a role, but it was not only that, that's for sure. But it's a role that many people around that planet do not know anything about, which was the original reason behind that story. Added to that, in other stories, but perhaps that was not emphasized enough, we highlighted the role also of Haitian high civil servants in really creating the conditions for setting Haiti on a way of a cycle of indebtedness. I can think of one high civil servant, for instance. His name was La Foresterie. He was a diplomat serving in France, and he was the one who negotiated many of the loans that were taken on the French market. Coincidentally, he retired in France, which was, kind of the country where he probably, thought that he was the most happy in, or clearly was not helping Asian interests at the time. So throughout the story, I think we highlighted several of those key characters and repeated that there was a responsibility. But taking it back to our original idea and to what Catherine said at the very beginning, the issue with the way people think about Haiti today is that it's always about corruption, natural disasters, being unlucky, sometimes only unlucky, mass poverty, and gun violence. But nobody thinks about this very original and 200 years old story that is the debt, So our goal was not to say this is the origin for all of what happened to Haiti, and this is the reason why Haiti is in that state today. But this is one of the reasons, and possibly an important reason, that you should know about, because everybody, not everybody, but many people have forgotten about it.
Well, to your point then, Constant, what does the, I'm saying revelation, and it's true that it was a revelation to many people because of the New York Times has spread, but many people already knew the existence of this story in different ways. But what does the story about this debt mean to the younger generation, many of whom are on this call right now? What does that mean to the next generation, you think? Is it education? Is it curiosity? Should people be angry? Does it serve a purpose?
That's a good question. I mean, the way I see it, the young Asian generation knows about that history. I think what our story, our series brings to them is the amount of information and detail, and especially the fact that we, for what historians say is a first, calculated very precisely how much Haiti had paid to France, which until recently was kind of unknown. We only had kind of broad estimates. So I think that's the major point of the story. And then there are a couple of other revelations about the role that France played in the early 2000s to kind of stave off Aristide's attempt to bring back the story to the front stage. So I think this is what is useful maybe for the young Asian generation, just the level of details and what they can do with that. For other people throughout the world, and I'll talk specifically about the French there because I'm French and because I could see the reactions around me from my friends, etc. I think it's just like something that they didn't know about at all. And I insist on at all because it's just a completely new story for much of the people in this country. And when they're reading that story, they're kind of reflecting about it. They're kind of making connections that they had never made between Haiti and France, connections about the impact of the Haitian Revolution on the French Revolution. The fact that slavery ended first in Haiti, not necessarily because of what France wanted to do, but because of the revolution that kind of forced France's hand, which is not what we're taught in France. You know, we're taught about just those big ideas and big visions that helped end slavery, which was not exactly that. So you make a lot of connections between the two countries. You better understand the state in which Haiti is today. I will, of course, not give names, but you know, some of my friends realized that they knew some people who were descendants of families that had benefited from that money. So it's kind of, I would say, reckoning with the past that is not necessarily your own past, but the past of your country, and understanding why France is where it is right now and why Haiti is where it is right now. I think that helps a lot.
You know, there was used the quote from a description from Thomas Piketty, famous economist, which is neocolonialism through debt, which was the first time I heard of something like this. Is there an example of another nation on earth that had to, because now when you see Haitian revolution, Haitian independence, it feels like there will be a big asterisk next to this with so much of what the story has revealed. I mean, is there another country in the world that has had to do something like this?
Do you mean paying a debt?
Yes. Yes.
No, this is a unique case in history. You know, I think we said that in the story as well. Usually, when you win your independence war, you're not supposed to pay the losers, which is what happened there, right? When we talk about war reparations, which is kind of what happened with Haiti, right? Like France comes back and say, you beat us in that war, well, you're going to pay us. Normally, this is basically the other way around. I can give you an example in 1815, after Napoleon lost his wars in Europe. France was forced to pay a huge amount of reparations to European countries because it had lost the war, because it had destroyed a lot of regions throughout Europe. Well, 10 years later, France forced Haiti to pay for a war that France had lost. You know, so this is a completely unique case in history. But I think what
the other thing is that there is a Swiss historian who has worked a lot on these type of basically abolition and what happened. And so the idea of paying former slave masters for their loss was very common, and it was politically the only way in the 1800s that, let's say, slave owners in all the British colonies would come on board. And similarly, you know, when you look at Martinique, the people were paid. The difference is it was the enslaver government that paid. And there were some cases like, you know, in Britain, in those colonies, they say, okay, you'll be free. You need to work for a certain amount of time for free for your former master. So you could say that was a payment, but it did not last generations. You know, this lasted generations. And it was a government formed of former enslaved people and their descendants paying, as opposed to the French government. And in other cases, it was always the enslaver government that was doing that. Now, there is one very small exception, and you know, this happened in the United States, where they did pay in the state in Washington, D.C., they paid something like the owners of 200 slave owners were paid. But again, it was the government that did that. Sorry, I interrupted you, Constant.
No, I was only going to say that what Piketty was referring to was not only the indemnity that was paid, but also this cycle of indebtedness that Haiti was thrown into for decades even after they finished paying the indemnity. And that indebtedness was also created through that National Bank of Haiti, which was Haitian in name only. It was created in France. It was controlled by French capitalists. And in that case, Haiti was certainly not a unique case in history. That type of bank that was controlling the finances of a colony or a former colony existed in many other countries, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in what was known then as Indochina, in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, in Egypt, in Turkey as well. All of this was also part of this sort of, I think Piketty described it right, neocolonialism through debt, which is that you force a country to give you all the power to control the finances of a country. You eventually push that country towards indebtedness with your own banks and own capitalists, and that way you really you really control the destiny of that country for quite a few decades.
I think we're going to move to questions. So
we should move to questions. As we do that, because we've been focusing so much on France, and if we get into the early part of the 20th century in 1915, the US becomes, is also putting their hands in the proverbial pot. Can you talk about that a little bit, and then we can possibly get through some of the questions that are in the chat. And please post your questions, folks.
I mean, unfortunately, our colleague Salam Gebrekaden's not here because she is the one who dug deep, deep, deep into the US occupation. One of the lingering questions, so when you read books about the independence debt or the double debt, you'll see that there's this huge debate as to when it ended. So some historians say 1886, 1888, and then there are those that say 1945, 1957. So we spent a long time trying to figure out what the continuation was, and whether, so Haiti took out this original loan, from these French consortium of banks in order to pay the first small section, a segment of this debt to the former colonists. And that basically set it on a slow crash course, and it wasn't for decades later, when they were almost done paying this debt, that they took out 2 more loans in the 1870s. And written in the contracts of the loans was the point was to pay off the double debt and to start finally building the country. So when we saw that gave us okay, so when did those loans end? And those, it took a long time for us to get down into, and it was Salam who did this, to get down into the weeds to see those loans were paid off in 1922 by the American controller just before they forced Haiti to take out another loan. So while you could say that there was this, and we'd never say this in our piece because it's so in the weeds and so difficult, what we say is that it basically set, this original double debt set Haiti on the road towards decades and decades and decades, or centuries of indebtedness. But what the Americans did is they basically followed the model that the French had already set, which was promising to invest in the country, taking over the finances, and not investing in the country, and pocketing a lot of the profits for their own administration. And that, for themselves, but also Citibank forced this loan, got this loan, pushed through a government that was a puppet government put in place by a military occupation of a country, right? And it continued to reap the profits of that until the end of the financial occupation of Haiti, which was in 1947. And then the French came back, they came back again. They said, oh, our loan from, you never paid off this loan earlier. And that wasn't paid off. So, the American occupation obviously had whole other hosts of problems. They brought back the corvée. They were run by out and out racists. There was huge other problems, but they can, and we included that in our story. But what we were really trying to do throughout this was follow the money, and how Haiti was this place that if you lived in it, if you were Haitian, you were going to be poor, but it could make you rich from the outside. And the American banks, saw this and they wanted to get in, and they basically, with the help of the American government, got in and continued to make really big profits on the backs of poor Haitians.
Oof. Okay. Let me ask a question that's in the chat here, which is, do you eventually seek to change the headline of your piece to how France extorted Haiti?
I'll let you go. No.
What can I say? The piece, I mean, the standards of journalism. Once it's published, we don't change a thing, unless it's a correction. So no,
Yeah,
we don't.
Exactly. What's next with this? What is the next part to this? I mean, are you going to follow up on, are you going to hound some of these banks? I mean, CIC is saying what? Are you, what is the next part? Because it can't just be left like this. I mean.
Well, on CIC, I think they said that they would hire researchers to look into their past. So I trust those researchers. I think I hope they'll do a good job. We'll see. We'll cover the news when we got some conclusions of that work. But so far we've not intended to kind of follow up on CIC and what they've done in Haiti. I think what could be interesting would be to work on, as I said, those sort of other banks that were created in other former colonies on a model that was quite similar to that of the National Bank of Haiti. In terms of others follow-up, we're obviously thinking of other stories, but I'm not sure we can really talk about them here.
Understood. I know there were so many figures in your piece, but one of the questions, if you have this off the top of your head, is how much did the US end up making during the occupation? Is there a figure, or at least a figure in today's numbers?
I don't think we have that figure. I mean, by the US, that would obviously be the National City Bank. The US itself did not, certainly did not help Haiti on its path towards economic development, but they did not really reap benefits, or I mean, we cannot put a number of that on this. As for the dividends and profits that the National City Bank made, I cannot remember a concrete figure from that story in the US. I would have to look into this.
My memory is, and I think you're right, but my memory is that we did see that, up to 1/4 of the Haitian government budget went to pay the office of the American administration office, some of whom the administrators were basically residing in Louisiana. And so they certainly paid themselves very well, and they were paying themselves some years more than the entire budget for education in Haiti.
Which isn't very different from the budget under previous recent Haitian administrations,
Right.
where more money was spent on perks for the senators and other government officials than it was spent on healthcare, education in Haiti. So
Sure.
It's a tradition that goes back to the American occupation. One other question that came up was, did you talk to Citibank, and did they have any response to the theories?
They declined to comment.
Really?
Yes.
They also did not afford us access to their archives. So they were we were sending them information from the very beginning and asking for access to archives. They refused access to their archives, and they refused comment.
Can you file a FOIA request for this, a Freedom of Information Act request?
I don't
Or is that just,
I don't believe you can with a bank like that.
it's
It's
private? It's,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not federal, I see.
Other questions?
There are.
There's one that says, why didn't Haiti default from its debt?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, other places did default on their debt. And it's something that the historian Gusti Gaillard, Clara Gaillard, I saw someone mentioning her in the chat. She raises in one of her books too. There seemed to be, you know, my answer to that is that we don't know. We can't interview those former finance ministers and the like. But I would say there'd be a number of reasons. One was there was an incredible pressure continued, and Constant in the archives found, you know, repeated threats that sometimes were sent with gunboats to Haiti from the French government about, you know, it was a matter of French government pride that this be paid. And they continued to threaten Haiti, you know, anytime, like after Boye was ousted, there was a few years that they didn't pay. There were lots of threatening letters. Like anytime that the Haitian government didn't pay, there was lots of threats. So there's that. But also people like, you know, Alex Dupuy will argue that there was a lot of pride in that upper class of government, you know, and the presidents, often the presidents of the country would be people who would send their children to France for education or go to France. And they took a lot of pride in their country, but also in themselves and paying this off. I think there was some element of pride too, that we will show the world that we are a worthy Black nation that like commits and pays up to our commitments, no matter how, you know, and so I would agree that there was some element of that also, but it is a really interesting question, you know, in today's era, when you know that many countries default on their debts, you know, and yet Haiti continued to pay. And I don't know if you have anything more you would add, Constant.
Yeah, I would add that Haiti was also deep into this web of kind of economic dependence with France. Two reasons for that. The first one is that, as we said before, Haiti was paying thanks to its revenues that it made on coffee exports. And at some point in the 19th century, instead of paying the debt through kind of classic traditional payments, it would actually paid with what at the time was called traite, which is that when they would send coffee to France, some of those revenues made on coffees would be kept in France as a way, as a payment for that debt, you know. So they were actually dependent on France buying their coffee to pay the debt. So that's one reason. The second one is, as we discussed before, this National Bank of Haiti was created in 1880, which was towards the very end of the payment of that double debt, but still there were another 8 years to pay. And the goal of the National Bank of Haiti was also to make sure that Haiti would pay its external debt. So you had another layer also of constraint and economic dependency that indirectly forced Haiti to pay and prevented it from defaulting.
Was Jean-Bertrand Aristide the only Haitian president or official speaking so publicly and loudly about this debt?
You mean in recent times?
Yes.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, there certainly were Haitian government ministers who were angry about France. You know, like we've already mentioned, Frederic Marcelin, although he doesn't, he's sort of lashing out mostly at the Haitian National Bank. But Jean-Bertrand Aristide and his government's campaign, in 2003 up until 2004 was the first real campaign around this issue, and the last real.
Someone brought up a point in saying that, Jewish families who survived the Holocaust or are descendants went to German banks to demand restitution. Is it different when it's a government versus families by name? Do you see what I mean? To be able to, could the Haitian government, could they still go to the French government? I mean, this is something that's definitely now out in the public. I mean, it's hanging there. It's not going away.
I think if you use the example of what Aristide tried to do, in our report, we saw documents about how they were preparing to launch a lawsuit in an international law court to get paid, which was also part of their campaign to pressure France. The tricky thing is that the difference with victims of the Holocaust is that they could base their restitution request on international laws, especially the fact that there's a crime against humanity that had just been enacted and that they could use. For the case of Haiti, if you want to bring that case to a court, you will find yourself with the difficulty that laws are not retroactive. And what do you do with a payment that happened in the 19th century and at the time when slavery was not illegal, when a treaty had been signed between France and Haiti under duress, that's for sure, but had been signed nonetheless. So my understanding of the efforts of the Aristide administration on that issue, that is bringing the case to a court, was that it would have been possibly difficult, not impossible, but possibly difficult. But I also think that that was also part of the strategy to kind of put the pressure on France and engage in negotiations, which France did not want to and didn't. As for whether a government can do that, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm really not sure about that.
We linked to a paper by a group of professors
Right.
who have been looking at that jurisdictionally in the States as to what would be the jurisdiction of it, and yeah, I'd be very interested to see, but it certainly was, we found in the papers around Aristide's campaign, it was the court of public opinion that they knew that they could perhaps win in.
Catherine, when you were in the Dondon, you start with the story of Adrienne Présent there. And you said early in the conversation that not many people knew about this debt when you went there. We spoke about it, but now that this has been out, have you in your conversations with descendants, direct descendants of the enslaved and enslavers, have you heard about their feelings about maybe receiving reparations? I mean, is this something that, I know it's so much about survival and just getting through, a day, that the idea that there could be this, this restitution, perhaps, is there any hope at all in people that did it translate in a certain way?
I think it's too early to tell, like in a personal way, first of all, I was really, 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 really happy that these were translated into Creole. And it's the first time that the paper has translated.
Yes, we have to mention that, of course. Yes.
And I know Michel de Graaf is talking, and he's the great, linguist of when it comes to Creole. And he wasn't talking to us throughout, but I was so really, really happy to see it in Creole. And obviously the hope was that coffee farmers in Dondon and other places would get access to this. And I was also really happy that the Creole translation was free, and you know how it works in Haiti. Like, we know it was circulating around WhatsApp. We know that certain radio stations are reading sections of it out loud. So, what the reaction is like, my many friends in Haiti who are among people who are among, like, I heard a lot of reaction from my educated friends in Haiti. I heard, and I'd love to hear, I know some of them are on the call right now. I heard, and I know that was an emotional reaction of basically feeling like the story that they had told themselves, but when thought they were crazy, was validated, in the Times, by this outsider publication. In terms of my friends who are poor, the last 6 months have been so hellish in Haiti. I have been dealing with death, kidnapping, and in their families. And so I feel like this question, that people like Adrian have been sort of saying things are just getting worse and worse, and we don't have the bandwidth, but I'd be really interested. I sent the story to the mayor of Dondon. I sent it to the cooperatives that I met with, and I'm really interested when I get to go back, at some point and meet in person with those people to ask them over, over a drink, what their longer, bigger reflections are.
I think they're looking for more questions if there are in the chat.
Yeah, it is Fedo Boyer. Yeah, Michel de Graaf mentions Fedo Boyer with Nick Andre and his team at Creole Trans that did the translation work.
On the French side, talking about reparations, France is years behind the US in discussions of race. And the communities are not organized in the way that they are in the US, for example. There's not a Black community. There's a Caribbean community. There's an African community. So they all have different objectives and different roles in French society. The Taubira law, which somebody mentioned, the first one that passed that had the French Assembly vote that slavery was a crime against humanity, also embedded some memorial ceremonies. For the first time, there were dates set to memorialize the end of slavery. And now every May 10th, there's a huge ceremony in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris and in cities around France, particularly port cities where slavery was very instrumental in their growth, like Bordeaux and Nantes. But it's a slow process and it's slowly evolving. And I don't see much pressure in France to pay reparations or even to, as Hollande was there some years ago and said, we owe Haiti a debt. And then they quickly ran around like crazy saying, we're not talking about money, we're talking about a moral debt.
And I would add, Joel, that in the Taubira law, initially there was an article in the bill that mentioned the creation of a committee of historians and experts that would study the possible reparations to be made to the victims of slavery. And this article was kept out of the final law and was deleted by a commission before the bill was voted in Parliament. So that tells you also a lot about the taboo, the difficulty, the fear that there still is in France whenever we talk about reparations and restitution. As one ambassador told me, one ambassador who was based in Haiti in the early 2000s. If basically if you make a move towards reparation for Haiti, you automatically open kind of this Pandora box with all of those other former colonies that could very much as well ask for reparations and restitutions. And I believe that France is kind of afraid of that from the moment it agrees to make some financial reparations, then many other countries could use that as a precedent. And in terms of money, that means a lot.
There was a question here about whether or not in your research, do you think that that this instability, this debt, played a role in the continued instability, political instability in Haiti? I'm not talking about natural disasters, which were also sort of quasi-man-made because of the results in them, but political instability.
It's a really great question. And I know that there is some young research looking at that kind of concept around the world. We didn't see, like we're not historians. Like this is already weird territory for us. We did a 200-year like investigation into Haiti. And so I think that's a great grounds for historians to dig into, but certainly I wouldn't say I am any authority as to what role I would say it's clear to us that the debt played a huge role in that while other countries, particularly at the time of the Belle Epoque and they were investing in huge infrastructure projects. And this is not just the United States and Britain and France, but also Costa Rica that was had a coffee economy. They were electrifying San Jose, and Haiti did not have the money to do it. So whether it would have done it or did, it just didn't have the money. And that was very clear. And I think I feel confident in stating that, but whether it was a factor in the continual instability in Haitian politics and the internecine battles that happened and that continue to happen in Haiti, I think that's really ripe ground for many PhDs.
I want to address a little bit the elephant in the room, which came up, in the days that followed the article about, a variety of academics who felt that they were slighted. Even though printing out the bibliography of your piece, I can't imagine how people could feel badly, but I also know what it can feel like, perhaps to feel sidelined when someone has helped or contributed, or maybe you made a call 3 years ago and you didn't phone that person again, and they felt that they should have been credited. Can you talk to that a little bit, just at least to address it?
Yeah, we as journalists, we talk to for these 4 stories, and there's also, I guess there's really 5. We talked to hundreds of people. We read hundreds of books and articles. We did a count at the end because of this. It's really common in journalism to talk to way more people. And I know you both would totally agree that you talk to way more people than you cite. And in a way, it gives you a sense of authority, that you can say things with authority. And, we're diggers, we're trying to find the truth. So obviously, in many stories I do, people are upset that you don't quote them and you say, look, your information was foundational in my understanding, and I'm sorry you weren't quoted. The difference here is we did decide to put out a 5,000 word bibliography, which is also quite unheard of. And we spent some time talking about that. Unheard of in terms of New York Times,
yes,
standards. We don't do that. And no newspaper I've ever worked at, and I've worked at a number, has ever done anything like that. It's not, usually you just cite people you quote, or you cite a book but we felt like we wanted to be clear from the beginning that we're not writing Haitian history here. We are not experts in Haitian history. We're not Haitian, you know, that we built this story on the backs of many historians and their works that were pivotal. And we felt like it was really important to, in terms of transparency, but also, you know, giving credit to people we didn't name. Unfortunately, we couldn't name everybody and we couldn't name every book. We just couldn't. It would be something that you wouldn't make your way through. Like I said, we read, there's 4 of this on this for more than a year, reading like, you know, books. That's the first book we read was from right after the revolution, was published in the late 1800s, up until a book that's been in here that we do link to, but like that just came out in, I think it was February, March. That was in February. So we read so we couldn't cite them all. And so we decided that we would cite ones that we felt were pivotal to our understanding and that we referred to many times, or that they held something we couldn't find anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also add that our goal was certainly not to replace historians. You know, as Catherine said, we're not historians. We used them a lot, and this is why we cited them in this long bibliography. But I think we also wanted to, with this story, to kind of help the research go forward on this forgotten story of the Asian debt, forgotten at least in the Western hemisphere. And that is also why we published the data that we compiled on the double debt on GitHub, so that everybody can use it, everybody can make the calculations again, check that for themselves, use it for future, I don't know, historical research, PhDs, whatever, so that it's not just, you know, a story that appears in the New York Times and we're credited for it and that's over. You know, we really want also to kind of share what we found so that it can be used for future research works.
Great.
Somebody asked, go ahead, Joël, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I said someone asked, because you just brought up, Constant, that this could be used for future research. Someone asked if something similar is going to be done as was done with the 1619 project with this series.
In terms of like books and
in terms of books, of research, of, yeah.
No, we don't have plans to do that at this point. You know, I don't know. I know that they have some plans, but at this point, we don't have plans to launch, I mean, that kind of infrastructure around the story. We're really, really happy to see that it's been read and shared. We are in negotiations to have it reprinted, particularly in the Creole and the French. So it's accessible for people, particularly in Haiti and in schools. And I think that that's just awesome that could happen, and we'll see where it goes. But at this point, we don't have plans to create that kind of infrastructure around it. We're kind of going back to our regular jobs. And I saw there was a question here too about whether, Constant, have you talked to the Minister of Education in France, Pap Ndiaye, about this?
I have not. You know, it's funny because he was clearly one of the historians that we thought about when we worked on that series, because he basically introduced Black studies in France, and he knows a lot about Haiti as well. Because he was not, you know, specializing on Haiti, I eventually did not reach out to him. But I was, you know, as many people in France, surprised that he was appointed the education minister. Look, we've not reached out to him because, I mean,
he's in trouble.
I mean, he's been criticized by the right in France for sure. But I mean, we have not reached out because how to say that? We're not going to write a story about, you know, did that piss you off at the government or whatever, you know, we're not going to write a story about this, or, you know, what was your reaction when you saw the story? I hope that he has read the story. I would be pleased to know that. This is not specifically his domain as education ministry, even though, as we've said before, this history is not taught in French school, and there are some organizations that have published statements after the stories came out to say it should be taught. I feel that this is the kind of stuff that it needs some time to percolate in people's mind and in the minds of the civil servants at the education ministry, which is a big mammoth. And when you want to change the program in France, when it comes to education, that takes years. So I'm not expecting something in the next few weeks, that's for sure.
If you can explain it, because you've been living and breathing this, the nuance of restitution versus reparations. I saw Michel de Graaf put that in the chat. In the case of Haiti, it would be restitution, not reparations. People use them interchangeably. Is that inappropriate? Could you explain the nuance with the two?
So restitution is for something that is material or that can be counted as a specific sum of money that was stolen and that you can restitute, in a similar form. You restitute a piece of art, which is what happens with the Benin bronzes. Germany restituting Benin bronzes as recently as 5 days ago, maybe. You could do that theoretically with a sum of money, right? Like we have a precise number. We know that France received 90 million francs from Haiti throughout the 19th century. It could theoretically restitute the money. Reparations is a little bit more complex because it is to repair sins that were done in the past, and we're most of the time talking about slavery, right? Like all of the, I would say, all of the scenes that are related to slavery, from the fact that development in a country was impossible, from just the terrible things that happened to thousands and hundreds of thousands of people for years and decades. So it's much more it's more vague, I would say, right? There's no precise number. You got to talk about this, you got to debate about this, eventually negotiate about this. I would only add that some activists, but also historians or experts, consider that restitution in itself is a form of reparation, right? You repair something, right? So, which is why most of the time we use reparation as this sort of a big term that you could use to describe everything. And then there's a second layer that is restitution. But in a sense, you repair something by restituting it. Wow.
It is interesting, though. We did see that, a lot of the arguments around the campaign in Haiti is that what is different is that it's about repayments of this, of payments for enslaved people that were made, as opposed to slavery, as opposed to like sort of the kidnapping of people and their descendants. Although I will say, when Aristide launched his campaign, it was for both. Even though he didn't quantify, or we don't know, but his slogan and his government slogan was réparation et restitution, or restitution, réparation, both.
Joël?
I think we're time to turn it back to our host.
Well, you had a story, Joël, that if you'd like to share before we start concluding this.
About my family?
Yes.
Yes, I had a particular interest in CIC because my French grandfather worked at that bank.
Wow.
And was I think the deputy director when the Americans invaded in 1915. And the Marines came to his door to ask him for the keys to the bank. And he said he didn't have them, although he did. And after they stomped around the yard a while, the Marines left and found somebody else. And the next day, my grandfather resigned from the bank. So
Wow.
this brought it back to a family.
Is that a story that you grew up knowing, or did you find it in
Yes.
a journal?
I knew it growing. I've seen it printed in other places, but
Wow, that's
it's all personal when it comes to Haiti.
That's really cool. Yeah, it really is, isn't it? So many people have history lives that way. It's amazing.
I wanted to ask both of you, Catherine and Constant, if you might have some final thoughts on this. I mean, I started out comparing this to an onion, and I want to finish it comparing it to an onion, because I don't think you have gone to the core of it, right? Or at least you've gotten close enough. Do you have any final thoughts and feelings about this as you do your day jobs, which must feel really boring now after this? I'm sure there's a little bit of withdrawal. Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Constant?
Yeah, I mean, this idea that this series may help change the narrative on Haiti feels important to me. That people from now on, or at least those who read the story, will think about Haiti not only as a country that is impacted by corruption, by gang violence, by natural disasters, but also a country that was from its very beginning stolen and put on a path of terrible indebtedness. I think it's important, if we can change a little bit the narrative about what are the keywords that are associated with Haiti, not only poverty, not only corruption, but also a unique case in history of a huge sum of money that was stolen and that did anything but help Haiti to develop economically speaking, and that the story could have been different had it not been for that debt.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to start by thanking you guys for moderating this and for inviting us to do this. It's been really awesome to see all the comments and just see these faces and names, many of whom, I'm seeing people like Hudicor. I think I met you at your hospital in Port-au-Prince or in Pétionville years ago. So it's cool to sort of see who's on here. And I did see a question to this effect, like, how did this change my lens or on Haiti? I feel like I'm not sure that it fully did. I think my lens was changed a long time ago reading the history of Haiti. But early on in the research, when we were just reaching out to every single historian we could find who knew anything about Saint-Domingue, like the Haiti before it became Haiti, and the debt. I talked to a PhD student who had spent a lot of time in the Aix-en-Provence archive. So I was calling him to get some help to figure out how to get some documentation. And he is an expert on Saint-Domingue, like before independence. He's doing his PhD on that. And he said something to me that has just really stuck with me. He said, I think about the independence debt like every week. And I was like, why? Like, you don't cover that part of history. That was in 1825, like long after Saint-Domingue had disappeared. And he said, I think about it because it's so unfair that France gets to be this country that's known for liberty, égalité, fraternité, and Haiti is known for corruption, poverty, and disaster. And really, Haiti should be known as the first Black independent country that threw off slavery in the Americas and has a legacy that is so important. And that should be its, at least part of its calling card around the world. And when it comes to Haiti, France's motto is definitely not liberty, equality, fraternity. So I think like that has resounded in me, and I just keep coming back to that thought of, like you said, Constant, about the narrative around Haiti. I hope, if anything, one of the small changes is that what we call in journalism is a nut graph. So, when you talk about a country, you fly in, you say Haiti is like the nut graph. Often for Haiti, for anything you read or any article on Haiti, news article will say it's the poorest
Country in the Western Hemisphere.
Western Hemisphere, the least developed, and also the most corrupt, according to Transparency International. I hope that this series, if one thing it does, is that there is a second beat to that. And it says, this is the first country, where en masse a slave uprising overthrew white colonizers decades before anywhere else. And it was made to pay for that audacity for generations.
And is still paying.
And that I hope becomes part in however form it's rewritten, but it becomes part of a consciousness for people who write about Haiti, particularly foreign people, who write about Haiti and come in.
I think that's it for us. Turn it back to our hosts.
And thank you again. Thank you all again for hosting us.
Thank you.
Well, give just a few more minutes, because I think it's really important for us who have worked on this series to express our gratitude to you all, those who spoke, moderated, translated, and all of you who contributed in the chat and took time out of your day to join us this afternoon. My name is Nadine Duplessis-Kearns. I'm here with the Haitian Ladies Network, one of the 8 organizations who came together to put this series. And I will take just a second to name them all, because I think it's important that we have begun something incredible together. Haitian Ladies Network, the Black Collective, Haitian American Foundation for Democracy, HAFD, Sant, Haitian Neighborhood Center, Island TV, Ayibopost, Haitian American Professionals Coalition, and Avanse Ansanm. So this is the effort that we that came together after the New York Times series launch. And Catherine Porter and Constant Mehu, we want to thank you for getting us started, for doing the work, building on the rich history of our Haitian historians and our Haitian institutions and our Haitian families who continue to work daily, not only to change Haiti, but to change the narratives and the way that we see ourselves, and we're proud of who we are as Haitians. The interpretation was important to us to be able to offer this series in Haitian Creole, our native tongue. And MARB Language Services based in Miami provided this interpretation. So we want to thank Debbie and Lourdes for your contributions to today's conversation. We encourage all of you all, this is just the beginning, it's part 1. So join us for part 2, which will focus on what we've already started touching upon, which is reframing our narratives, not only about Haiti, but about ourselves, the stories we are leaving behind for our children and the future to come. And then we've already started talking about what's next. So where do we go from here as a community of Haitians in Haiti and Haitians wherever we are? What is it that we can do together to continue to build our country? If you've not registered for part 2 and part 3, the link is in the chat. So please join us via Zoom once again for part 2 and part 3. And also, we ask that you take just a few seconds and complete a really short survey. We want to hear from you about the series and your ideas for part 2 and part 3. And this is a dialogue, and we could not have done this without all of your attention and your focus this afternoon. And Magali and Joel, you are true. The pride of Haiti continues to live in all that you do and all that you've done for us. And we are so grateful for your contributions for kicking off this series. Again, thank you to all of our partner organizations. And you can watch this again on our respective Facebook pages and follow us and reach out to us. And we look forward to continuing these conversations and galvanizing ourselves to do what it is that we want, that we need to do for ourselves and for our country. So thank you. And thank you for joining us this afternoon.